The autumn wind rattled the window panes of Ashworth Manor with a persistence that matched the creditor's letters piling upon Marcus Ashworth's mahogany desk, each envelope a white accusation against the fading grandeur of his ancestral home. Rain streaked the glass like tears the house itself might weep. If stone and mortar could mourn their own decline, and Marcus sat in his study, surrounded by the watchful eyes of his forebears, their painted faces gazing down from portraits whose gilt frames had long since tarnished. The fire in the hearth struggled against the draught that seeped through cracks in the ceiling plaster, casting shadows that danced across unpaid bills and final notices, across demand letters stamped with seals that seemed to burn into his vision even when he closed his eyes. He was the last of the Ashworths, the final guardian of a legacy that stretched back 3 centuries, and that weight pressed upon his shoulders with such force that sometimes he could scarcely draw breath beneath it. His grandfather stared at him from above the mantelpiece, stern and unyielding in his military regalia, a man who had commanded respect and fortune in equal measure, who had never known the particular shame of watching creditors circle like carrion birds over the corpse of family pride. Marcus lifted another envelope, knowing before he opened it what words awaited him inside, what polite threats wrapped in formal language would demand payment he could not provide. The estate was crumbling, not in the dramatic collapse of earthquake or fire, but in the slow dissolution of neglect and poverty, tiles sliding from the roof to shatter in the courtyard below, walls weeping with damp that left brown stains like spreading disease, gardens gone wild and woolly, where once his mother had walked among carefully tended roses. He remembered her there, remembered her laughter, remembered when this house had felt alive rather than like a mausoleum to better days, and the memory was a knife that twisted in his chest. Outside, the oaks that lined the drive swayed in the October gale, their leaves torn away and scattered, and Marcus thought with bitter irony that they at least would grow new leaves come spring, while the Ashworth fortunes had no such season of renewal awaiting them. Tomorrow his solicitor would arrive with what the man had called, in his careful letter, a proposal that may interest you, and Marcus knew with the weary certainty of desperation exactly what sort of proposal might save a gentleman too proud to work and too poor to maintain his birthright. He poured himself another measure of brandy, one of the last bottles from his father's cellar, and watched the amber liquid catch the firelight, wondering if his ancestors would forgive him for what he suspected he was about to do, or if their painted eyes would judge him as harshly as he already judged himself. Mr. Pemberton arrived precisely at 11 o'clock, his black coat spotted with rain, his leather case clutched against his chest as though it contained secrets too valuable to trust to the weather, and Marcus received him in the drawing-room rather than his study, unable to bear another hour surrounded by those accusing letters and the silent judgment of ancestral portraits. The solicitor was a thin man with careful eyes that had witnessed too many gentlemen's falls from grace to show surprise at another, and he settled into the worn velvet chair with the practiced efficiency of one who had delivered difficult news in fine houses across England. "Mr. Ashworth," he began, extracting documents from his case with movements that seemed almost rehearsed, "I have been approached by Mr. Thomas Hartwell, a gentleman of considerable means who has built his fortune in textiles and shipping, regarding a matter of mutual benefit." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, the mask of aristocratic composure he had worn since childhood, fitting over his features like armor against the indignity of what was surely coming. Pemberton continued, laying papers upon the small table between them with the precision of a card dealer. "Mr. Hartwell has a daughter, Eleanor, his only child, a young woman of suitable age and, by all accounts, of respectable character and education, though her mother was, regrettably, of common birth before her marriage." The solicitor paused, allowing the implication to settle like dust in the quiet room, and Marcus understood immediately what was being offered, and what bargain was being struck in the careful language of legal men who trafficked in the buying and selling of futures. "He seeks," Pemberton said, his voice taking on the tone of one reciting terms already negotiated, "a union that would provide his daughter with the social elevation that his wealth alone cannot purchase, an entrance into society that remains, despite his fortune, firmly closed to those of mercantile origins." Marcus's pride reared up like a wounded horse, every fiber of his being revolting against the notion of selling his name, his heritage, his very identity to the daughter of a tradesman. Yet even as disgust rose in his throat, he thought of the roof that leaked in 17 places, of the servants he had dismissed for lack of wages, of the portraits he had nearly been forced to sell, and his voice when he spoke was hollow. "And what sum does Mr. Hartwell propose as settlement?" The question tasted like ashes, like defeat, like the final surrender of everything his family had once stood for. But Pemberton named a figure that made Marcus's breath catch despite himself, a dowry so substantial that it would not merely save the estate but restore it, would pay every debt, and leave enough to secure the future his ancestors had built, and he had nearly destroyed. They discussed terms in the grey afternoon light, the solicitor's voice a steady drone of legalities and provisions, of marriage settlements and financial arrangements, and Marcus heard himself agreeing, heard himself consenting to meet the girl, heard himself becoming complicit in his own reduction to a commodity, a title for sale to the highest bidder. When Pemberton finally departed, his case lighter by one signed agreement, Marcus sat alone in the drawing-room and told himself it was simply a business transaction, nothing more than a practical solution to an impossible situation, that gentlemen had married for advantage throughout history, that he need feel nothing, owe nothing beyond the bare civilities required by law and social custom. Yet, as he stared into the dying fire, he could not quite silence the small voice that whispered of shame, could not quite convince himself that his grandfather's painted eyes would not burn with contempt. Could they see what their descendant had become? A man so desperate that he would bind himself to a stranger for gold, would trade whatever remained of his honor for the preservation of walls and grounds that might, in the end, be nothing more than an elaborate tomb for pride already dead. The Hartwell townhouse stood on a street in Belgravia, where new money had built monuments to its own ambition, all white stone and gilded ironwork that gleamed with the aggressive brightness of recent acquisition, and Marcus arrived on a grey November afternoon with his pride wrapped around him like armor against the distaste that churned in his stomach. A servant in livery too elaborate for good taste led him through halls, hung with paintings whose frames cost more than their artistic merit warranted, past furniture that spoke of expense rather than elegance, everything proclaiming wealth with the subtle refinement of a marketplace vendor crying his wares, and Marcus felt his aristocratic sensibilities recoil even as he reminded himself that this vulgarity was purchasing his salvation. Mr. Hartwell received him in a drawing-room wallpapered in crimson silk, a florid man whose handshake was too firm and whose smile revealed the anxiety beneath his bluff confidence, and beside him stood a young woman in a dress of modest grey that seemed almost penitent among the room's ostentation. Eleanor Hartwell was not beautiful, Marcus noted, with the cold assessment of a man purchasing livestock, her features too indefinite to be striking, her figure unremarkable in its slenderness, her brown hair dressed simply in a style that suggested either lack of vanity or lack of imagination. And when she curtsied, her eyes remained fixed upon the carpet, as though she feared what judgment she might see in his face. He bowed with the mechanical precision of good breeding, murmured the expected pleasantries, and watched as her father pushed her forward, like a merchant displaying goods, saw how her hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward a chair, how her voice when she offered tea was barely above a whisper. They sat in that crimson room while her father dominated the conversation with talk of his mills and his ships and his plans for expansion, and Marcus responded with the minimum civility required, his attention drifting over the gaudy furnishings, calculating the worth that surrounded him, seeing not a person but a ledger of assets that would soon transfer to his name. Eleanor spoke perhaps 3 sentences during the entire visit, each one carefully chosen and properly phrased, her education evident in her diction, even as her demeanor suggested a crushing awareness of her social inadequacy, and Marcus found himself annoyed by her timidity, by the way she seemed to shrink into her chair as though apologizing for her very existence. Yet twice he caught her watching him, her gaze flickering away the instant his eyes moved toward her, and in those brief glimpses he saw something that unsettled him, a quality of observation that suggested she was reading him as thoroughly as he was cataloguing her worth, that behind those downcast eyes a mind was working, assessing, understanding perhaps more than he wished her to understand. The meeting concluded with arrangements made for the wedding, dates discussed and agreed upon with the same brisk efficiency one might employ in negotiating a business contract, and when Marcus took his leave, bowing once more over Eleanor's limp hand, he told himself he felt nothing but relief that she at least seemed biddable and quiet, that she would not trouble him with demands or expectations beyond the transaction they both comprehended. As his carriage rolled away from that temple to mercantile success, he did not look back, did not wonder what thoughts moved behind Eleanor Hartwell's careful composure, did not imagine that she had seen in his cold appraisal exactly what he had seen in her trembling hands, the recognition of two people being traded like commodities in a marketplace where love had no currency and only fortune spoke with authority. The wedding took place on a December morning when frost painted the church windows with patterns that resembled nothing so much as prison bars, and Marcus stood at the altar in his grandfather's dress coat, altered to fit his narrower shoulders, watching the assembled guests with the detached observation of a man witnessing his own execution. Society had come in force, drawn by curiosity and the promise of spectacle, the pews filled with faces he had known since childhood, faces that wore expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed satisfaction at seeing the proud Ashworth brought so low as to marry a merchant's daughter for her dowry, and he met their gazes with the cold indifference that generations of breeding had perfected, his features arranged in a mask of aristocratic composure that revealed nothing of the shame that burned beneath his skin. When Eleanor appeared at the church door on her father's arm, she was dressed in white silk that must have cost a fortune, the gown's elaborate construction speaking of the finest modistes in London, yet somehow the magnificence of the dress only emphasized her plainness, made her seem even more insignificant against its grandeur, a small, pale figure drowning in expensive fabric and her father's ambitions. She walked down the aisle with measured steps, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond Marcus's shoulder, and he watched her approach with the clinical interest of a man appraising property, noting the tremor in her hands that clutched her bouquet too tightly, the unnatural pallor of her cheeks that no amount of powder could warm, the way her breath came shallow and quick beneath the tight bodice of her gown. They stood together before the vicar, two strangers bound by legal documents and financial necessity, and when the ancient words of the ceremony began, Marcus heard them as though from a great distance, his responses automatic and emotionless, the phrases he had heard at countless weddings transformed into something hollow and transactional when applied to his own union. Eleanor's voice when she spoke her vows was barely audible, each word forced through lips that seemed frozen, and Marcus did not look at her, kept his gaze fixed upon the stained glass window behind the vicar's head, unable or unwilling to meet the eyes of the woman he was binding himself to for the remainder of his days. The exchange of rings was performed with the mechanical precision of signing contracts, his fingers cold and steady as he slipped the gold band onto her trembling hand, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus felt nothing except a distant relief that the performance was nearly concluded, that soon he could retreat behind the formalities of the wedding breakfast and then escape entirely to the solitude he had already determined would characterize their married life. The reception was held in the Hartwell townhouse, that monument to mercantile success, and Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations with words that meant nothing, watching as Eleanor sat pale and silent beside him at the head table, and around them the whispers circulated like poison. Society's judgment delivered in murmurs behind fans and gloved hands, speculation about how much the merchant had paid for his daughter's elevation, how long the proud Ashworth would tolerate his bought bride, whether the marriage would even be consummated or merely exist as a legal fiction to transfer wealth from one ledger to another. When the interminable celebration finally concluded, and Marcus handed Eleanor into the carriage that would take them to Ashworth Estate, he sat as far from her as the confined space allowed, and in the silence of that journey, broken only by the sound of horses' hooves on frozen roads, neither spoke, each lost in private contemplation of the bargain they had struck, the life sentence they had accepted, and Marcus told himself he felt nothing but satisfaction that the transaction was complete, that his debts would soon be settled, that he need never again face the humiliation of creditors at his door, though somewhere beneath the careful architecture of his self-deception, a small voice whispered of opportunities lost, of bridges burned, of a woman beside him who deserved better than his cold indifference, and who would receive nothing more for all the years that stretched ahead like an endless winter road. The estate appeared through the carriage window as evening descended, its stone facade rising from the winter landscape like a monument to faded glory. The manor house itself still possessing the austere beauty of its Georgian lines, despite the evident decay that showed in crumbling stonework and windows where broken panes had been inexpertly repaired, and Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass, studying her new home with an expression Marcus could not read and did not try to interpret. He had said nothing during the final hour of their journey, his silence a wall between them as solid as any constructed of brick and mortar, and when the carriage halted before the entrance, where a handful of servants waited in the gathering darkness, he descended without offering his hand to assist her, leaving her to navigate the steps alone while he strode ahead to issue curt instructions to the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Blackwood, whose lined face registered no emotion at the sight of her new mistress. Eleanor followed him into the great hall, where portraits of his ancestors gazed down from smoke-darkened walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge this merchant's daughter who dared enter their domain, and she stood small and lost in her traveling dress, while Marcus spoke with cold efficiency about household arrangements, his words establishing the architecture of their separation with the precision of a barrister drafting terms of imprisonment. "Your rooms are in the east wing," he said without looking at her directly, gesturing toward a corridor that led away from the hall. "Mrs. Blackwood will show you the way and explain the household routines. My own quarters are in the west wing, and I trust we shall each respect the other's privacy. Meals can be taken separately, unless circumstances require our joint presence, and should you need anything you may communicate your requirements through the housekeeper." Eleanor listened to this recitation of boundaries, with her hands clasped before her, her face pale in the lamplight, and when he finished, she said only, "Thank you," her voice steady despite the tremor Marcus thought he detected beneath the surface, and then she turned to follow Mrs. Blackwood up the wide staircase, her steps careful and measured, her back straight with a dignity that was either courage or pride, or perhaps simply the numbness of someone who had expected nothing better than this cold reception. Marcus watched her ascend until she disappeared around the landing, then retreated to his study, where he poured himself brandy and stood before the fire. Telling himself he felt only relief that the awkward necessities of the day were concluded, that she seemed sensible enough to understand the terms of their arrangement, and that soon her money would begin the work of restoration, and he could return to the solitary existence he preferred, though something in her quiet acceptance disturbed him in ways he refused to examine. In the east wing, Eleanor moved through rooms that smelled of disuse and camphor, touching the furniture that had been hastily uncovered for her arrival, fine pieces worn by time and neglect, running her fingers over the window-sills, where dust still gathered despite the servants' preparations. And when Mrs. Blackwood finally left her alone, she crossed to the window that overlooked the gardens, or what had once been gardens, now overgrown and wild in the winter darkness, bare branches tangled against the sky like supplicating arms. She stood there for a long time, her reflection ghostly in the glass, studying the shadows of this place that would be her prison or her home, depending upon choices not yet made. And as she looked out at the abandoned beauty of grounds that spoke of care once given and then withdrawn, she began to understand something of the man who had married her with such cold necessity, the depth of isolation that must have preceded his fall, the pride that kept him locked behind walls even as those walls crumbled around him. And instead of the anger or despair she might have felt, Eleanor experienced a strange settling of purpose, as though in this faded grandeur she had found something that called to her in ways her father's garish townhouse never had, something worth preserving, worth coaxing back to life, worth the patience that this strange marriage would require. The weeks that followed their marriage established a pattern of careful avoidance, two people sharing a house yet living such separate existences that they might have been strangers, occupying adjacent buildings, and Marcus threw himself into the work of restoration with an intensity that bordered on obsession, in meeting with architects and contractors, reviewing estimates and plans, watching as Eleanor's dowry began the slow process of reversing decades of decay, and he told himself his satisfaction came purely from seeing his ancestral home returned to its former glory, not from any desire to prove himself worthy of the fortune that had purchased his name. Eleanor, for her part, moved through the estate like a ghost, quiet and unobtrusive, spending her mornings in the library where she had discovered shelves of books that no one had touched in years, dust-covered volumes of philosophy and poetry and natural history that she read with evident pleasure. Her slim figure curled in the window seat, with afternoon light falling across the pages, and in the hours after luncheon she walked the grounds regardless of weather, exploring the overgrown gardens and neglected pathways, sometimes standing for long periods before particular features, as though committing them to memory, or perhaps imagining what they might become with proper care. The servants observed this strange marriage with the keen interest of those whose lives depended upon understanding the moods and requirements of their employers, and in the kitchen and servants' hall they whispered about the master, who barely acknowledged his wife's existence, who arranged his schedule to avoid encountering her, who took his meals in his study or the small breakfast room, while she dined alone in the formal dining room, and about the mistress who never complained of this treatment, who spoke to them with a courtesy they had not experienced in years, who seemed to genuinely care about their welfare in ways that puzzled them after so long serving a master consumed by his own troubles. Mrs. Blackwood reported to Marcus that his wife required very little, made no demands for new furnishings or fashionable refurbishments, seemed content with the simple routine she had established, and Marcus received this information with a curt nod that suggested approval while refusing to acknowledge any curiosity about Eleanor's activities or state of mind. And when the housekeeper mentioned that the new Mrs. Ashworth had inquired about the history of the estate and seemed particularly interested in hearing stories about his mother, he felt an uncomfortable tightening in his chest that he refused to examine, dismissing the topic and returning his attention to the papers scattered across his desk. At night, lying awake in his chambers in the West Wing, Marcus sometimes heard faint sounds from the distant East Wing, footsteps or the closing of a door, reminders that he was no longer alone in this house, and he told himself he felt nothing about Eleanor's presence except gratitude, that she understood the terms of their arrangement, that she did not press for the companionship or affection he had no intention of providing, and that she seemed as content with their separate existences as he professed to be. Though occasionally in those dark hours before sleep, he wondered what she thought about in her solitary rooms, whether she regretted the bargain her father had struck, whether she felt the weight of this silent house as he did, and then he would push such thoughts away, reminding himself that their marriage was a transaction completed, a problem solved, nothing more than a practical solution to practical difficulties, and that any consideration of Eleanor as a person, rather than a means to an end, was both unnecessary and dangerous to the careful equilibrium he had established. Spring arrived with the tentative warmth of renewal, and Marcus found himself noticing changes to the estate that had nothing to do with the contractor's work or the restoration of stonework and roof tiles, changes that seemed to have occurred while his attention was deliberately fixed elsewhere. And the first thing that caught his awareness was the garden on the south terrace, in the very garden his mother had loved before her death 15 years prior, a space that had since become a wilderness of tangled roses and choked pathways. And walking past it one morning, on his way to meet with the estate manager, Marcus stopped abruptly when he saw that someone had been working there, clearing the weeds, pruning the overgrown bushes, revealing the original design that he had thought lost forever to neglect and time. He stood there longer than he intended, studying the careful work that had exposed the old stone borders and the fountain at the center, now cleaned and somehow made functional again, the water trickling from the mouth of the weathered dolphin his mother had always loved, and he knew without asking that Eleanor had done this, and that she had spent hours in the cold earth bringing back to life something he had allowed to die, and the knowledge stirred something uncomfortable in his chest that felt almost like gratitude, but also like guilt for reasons he could not name. Days later, entering the library in search of a particular volume on estate management, Marcus noticed that the room had been transformed, not with new furnishings or elaborate changes, but with a reorganization so thoughtful and intelligent that he stood amazed at the improvement. Books previously scattered without system now arranged by subject and author, damaged volumes set aside for repair, a comfortable reading area established near the best light, and when he found the book he sought, he discovered that Eleanor had created a catalogue, written in her neat, precise hand, that made the collection accessible in ways it had never been during his own haphazard stewardship of his family's library. He found himself running his fingers over her handwriting, noting the intelligence in her organizational choices, The way she had grouped philosophy with related texts created cross-references for volumes that touched on multiple subjects, and he realized with a start that she must have spent weeks on this task, working quietly while he avoided her, bringing order to chaos without ever seeking acknowledgement or thanks. The servants, too, seemed different, their manner less harried and fearful than it had been before Eleanor's arrival, and Marcus overheard Mrs. Blackwood speaking with unusual warmth about the new mistress, who asked after the health of the housekeeper's sister in Manchester, who had arranged for the elderly groundskeeper to receive proper medical attention for his rheumatism, who remembered the names of all the staff and spoke to them as though they were people rather than merely servants. And hearing this, Marcus felt ashamed of his own long neglect of those who had served his family faithfully through years of decline. But it was the music that finally penetrated the walls he had constructed around himself, the piano in the music room that had stood silent since his mother's death. And one evening, as he walked past that closed door, he heard the most achingly beautiful melody, played with a skill and sensitivity that stopped him in his tracks, and he stood in the darkened corridor listening to Eleanor play, knowing she believed herself alone and unheard, and the music she created was full of such melancholy beauty that Marcus felt something break open inside him, some sealed chamber of emotion he had locked away, when he decided that feeling anything was too dangerous in a life defined by duty and survival. He returned night after night to stand outside that door, drawn by the haunting melodies she drew from the instrument his mother had loved, and sometimes he found himself leaning against the wall with his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him, feeling things he had no name for. And once, when Eleanor played a piece his mother had often performed, tears came unbidden to his eyes, and he had to turn away, shaken by the force of grief he thought he had mastered years ago, and by something else too, a dawning awareness that the woman he had married as a transaction, the woman he had barely looked at and deliberately ignored, was transforming his house, and perhaps, though he resisted the thought, transforming him as well, in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The storm arrived on a May evening with the sudden violence of spring tempests, thunder rolling across the countryside like artillery fire and rain, lashing the windows with such force that the old glass panes rattled in their frames, and Marcus had sought refuge in the library, the one room in the house where he felt most himself, intending to review the latest accounts from the estate manager, and perhaps lose himself in the familiar comfort of numbers and practical concerns. But when he entered, he found Eleanor already there, curled in the window seat with a book in her hands, so absorbed in her reading that she did not hear him enter, and his first instinct was to withdraw, to maintain the careful distance they had preserved for months. But something made him hesitate, perhaps the way the lamplight fell across her face, revealing an expression of such intense concentration, or perhaps simply that the storm outside made the prospect of returning to his cold study less appealing than usual, and so he moved quietly to the shelves, selecting a volume at random, settling into one of the wing-back chairs near the fireplace, where a servant had laid a fire against the evening's chill. They remained thus for some time, two people alone together yet separate, the only sounds the crackle of burning wood and the fury of rain against glass, until Eleanor shifted slightly, and Marcus glanced up to see what she was reading, and recognition jolted through him when he recognized the worn leather binding of Schopenhauer's essays, the very volume he himself had been reading just days before. And before he could stop himself, he spoke, his voice rough from disuse in her presence, asking what she thought of Schopenhauer's arguments about suffering and will, and Eleanor looked up with startled eyes, clearly surprised to find she was not alone, a faint color rising in her cheeks as she considered his question with visible seriousness, before answering in her quiet, measured voice that she found the philosopher's pessimism both compelling and troubling, that while she understood his reasoning about the nature of desire and dissatisfaction, she could not fully accept his conclusion that life was essentially suffering. And Marcus found himself leaning forward, engaged despite himself, arguing that Schopenhauer's observations about human nature were accurate even if his conclusions were bleak. And Eleanor responded with a counter-argument that showed she had not merely read the text, but had thought deeply about it. And suddenly they were in the midst of a genuine conversation, ideas flowing between them with an ease that astonished Marcus, who had assumed that the merchant's daughter would be educated only in the superficial accomplishments deemed necessary for a woman of her class. The discussion ranged from philosophy to literature, touching on questions of free will and moral responsibility, the nature of happiness, and the possibility of meaning in an indifferent universe. And Marcus discovered that Eleanor possessed not only intelligence, but originality of thought, and that she challenged his assumptions in ways that made him reconsider positions he had held for years. And more than once he found himself laughing at some particularly clever observation she made, at the sound strange to his own ears after so long. And he noticed that when she became animated in defense of some idea, her whole face transformed, her eyes bright with passion, her hands gesturing to emphasize her points, and he wondered how he had ever thought her plain, how he had looked at her on their wedding day and seen nothing but a means to an end. Hours passed unmarked, the storm continuing its assault outside, while inside, the library grew warm and close, filled with the energy of minds meeting as equals. And when at last Eleanor glanced toward the window and remarked with surprise that it had grown quite late, Marcus felt a curious reluctance to see the evening end, this unexpected communion that had emerged from chance and weather. And as they rose and bid each other good night with a formality that seemed suddenly absurd after the intimacy of their conversation, Marcus found himself unsettled in ways he could not name, as though some carefully constructed wall had developed a crack, and walking back to his chambers through the dark corridors of the sleeping house, he could not stop thinking about the intelligence in her eyes, the grace of her arguments, the way she had looked at him not with the deference he had expected but with genuine interest and respect. And he lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them, some barrier had been breached, and the certainty he had maintained about the nature of their arrangement, about his own immunity to anything beyond polite coexistence, no longer felt as solid as it had that morning, and the realization brought not comfort, but a strange mixture of anticipation and fear that kept sleep at bay until the first grey light of dawn crept through his windows. The days following that storm-bound conversation in the library brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the rhythms of the house, and Marcus found himself making choices he would have considered unthinkable mere weeks before, beginning with the simple decision to take breakfast in the morning room rather than his study, a change that meant encountering Eleanor at the start of each day. And though their first shared mornings were marked by awkward silences and overly formal pleasantries, gradually something easier emerged between them, a companionability that allowed for comfortable quiet as well as conversation, and he discovered that she read the newspaper with genuine interest, that she had opinions on matters of politics and economy that were surprisingly well informed, and more than once he found himself asking her view on some issue troubling the estate, and her responses were thoughtful and practical in ways that made him value her counsel. He began to invite her to walk the grounds with him, ostensibly to show her the progress of various repairs and improvements her dowry had made possible, but truly because he found himself wanting her company, wanting to share with her the history of every folly and fountain, every ancient oak and crumbling wall. And as they walked together through the late spring sunshine, he told her stories he had not spoken aloud in years, tales of his childhood racing through these same gardens, of his mother's love for the roses now blooming again thanks to Eleanor's patient restoration, of his father's stern pride and impossible expectations, and Eleanor listened with an attention that felt like a gift, asking questions that showed she understood not just the facts, but the emotions beneath them, the weight of legacy and the loneliness of being the last bearer of an ancient name. Marcus noticed things about her he had been too deliberately blind to see before, the way her whole face transformed when something genuinely amused her, her rare smile breaking through like sunlight through clouds, and rendering her not merely pretty but luminous, the grace in her movements as she bent to examine some plant or turned to look back at the house, the intelligence in her eyes that he had somehow mistaken for timidity, and he found himself watching her when he thought she was not aware, studying the curve of her cheek, the delicate strength of her hands, the way she tilted her head when considering some question, and once when she laughed at some story he had told, the sound bright and unguarded. He felt something catch in his chest, a sensation both painful and sweet that he did not dare examine too closely. Dinners became occasions he anticipated rather than endured, the formal dining room seeming less vast and cold when Eleanor sat across from him, candlelight softening her features as they discussed books and ideas, debated questions of philosophy and morality, shared observations about the world with an ease that astonished him, and sometimes he would look up to find her watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something gentle and questioning in her gaze that made him want simultaneously to move closer and to flee. And he realized with a confusion that bordered on panic that the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself, the barriers that had protected him through years of loss and disappointment, were developing cracks he could no longer ignore, fissures through which dangerous feelings were beginning to seep. And though he told himself it was merely gratitude for her improvements to his home, merely appreciation for her intelligence and companionship, some deeper part of him recognized the lie in this reasoning, understood that what he felt was something far more profound and far more terrifying than simple appreciation, something that threatened to transform the careful transaction of their marriage into something real and vulnerable and utterly beyond his control. The discovery came on a June afternoon, when Marcus was reviewing the quarterly accounts in his study, a task that had become almost pleasurable now that the ledgers showed steady improvement rather than the grim descent into ruin he had tracked for years before his marriage. And as he examined the detailed records his estate manager had prepared, he noticed a discrepancy in the household expenditures, a series of payments to the estate workers that exceeded what he had authorized, and curious rather than alarmed, he summoned his steward to inquire about the matter, and the man's uncomfortable shifting and reluctant explanation revealed that Lady Eleanor had been supplementing the workers' wages from her own personal allowance, ensuring that the older servants and those with families received enough to live comfortably. And this revelation led Marcus to investigate further, to request a full accounting of Eleanor's personal finances, and what he discovered in the documents his banker reluctantly provided left him first stunned and then filled with a churning confusion of emotions he could not immediately name. Eleanor had systematically divested herself of nearly everything that remained of her fortune beyond what she had brought as her dowry, transferring substantial sums to charitable institutions for the care of orphans and the indigent, establishing pensions for her father's former employees who had been let go when the merchant business was sold, funding schools for the education of working-class girls, and keeping for herself only the smallest allowance, barely enough to maintain the modest wardrobe she wore and purchase the occasional book. And Marcus sat in his study with these documents spread before him, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to comprehend what she had done and why, and the questions burned through him with an intensity that demanded immediate answers. And so he went to find her, his footsteps quick and hard against the marble floors, and he discovered her in the morning room where she sat, writing letters in the afternoon light, and she looked up at his entrance with a smile that faltered when she saw his expression, the papers he held clutched in his hand. He asked her, his voice tight with an emotion he could not control, if the accounts were accurate, if she had truly given away nearly everything. And Eleanor set down her pen with hands that remained remarkably steady, and confirmed that yes, she had disposed of her remaining wealth as she saw fit. And when he demanded to know why she would do such a thing without consulting him, and without even informing him of her intentions, she looked at him with eyes that held both sadness and a quiet strength that he had come to recognize as quintessentially hers, and she said in that measured voice that had once seemed timid, but now struck him as containing depths of courage he had never possessed, that she had been married for her money, and having provided what was needed to save his estate, she saw no reason to maintain the source of their arrangement, that she would rather have nothing and know that any regard between them was genuine than spend her life wondering if she was valued only for her fortune. Marcus stared at her, the words landing like blows, and he asked with a harshness born of fear and confusion how she could make such a decision, how she could rob herself of security and independence. And Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, and replied that she had bought her freedom, that wealth had bound her to a marriage of convenience, and by divesting herself of it, she had removed the chains from both of them, and that he was free now to regard her as a person rather than a transaction, or to regard her not at all if that was his preference. And the calm dignity with which she spoke these devastating words, the pain he could see beneath her composure, left Marcus unable to respond, and he stood there in the doorway with the afternoon light streaming past him, holding the evidence of her extraordinary act, and he felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet, as though everything he thought he understood about their marriage, about Eleanor herself, about his own carefully maintained emotional distance, and had been revealed as illusion, and the realization was terrifying in its implications. In what it demanded he examine about his own heart. And so he turned and left without another word, unable to face what her actions had laid bare, the mirror she had held up to his soul, showing him a reflection he was not yet ready to confront. Marcus returned to the morning room that same evening, his emotions having shifted through the hours from confusion to anger, a safer feeling than the vulnerability that lurked beneath it, and he found Eleanor still there, now standing by the window looking out at the gardens that had become her domain. And when she turned at his entrance, her face was composed but pale, and he demanded with a harshness that masked his fear how she could have done this thing, how she could have stripped herself of security and independence without a word to him, without consideration for the position it placed him in, and his voice rose as he spoke, the anger flowing more freely now. "You've made me a charity case," he said, the words bitter on his tongue, "reduced me to a man who cannot even support his own household without his wife's secret subsidies, who lives on the kindness of a woman who has now impoverished herself for his benefit. Do you understand what that makes me?" Eleanor faced him without flinching, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands that she clasped before her, and she said in that quiet voice that somehow carried more force than his shouting, "I've made you free." The words struck him like a physical blow, stopping his tirade mid-breath, and she continued with a dignity that shamed his anger. "I was married for my fortune. Lord Ashworth, we both know this truth, however uncomfortable it may be to speak aloud, and I chose to provide what was needed to save your estate, because that was the bargain we made, but I saw no reason to maintain beyond that the source of our arrangement, to spend my life wondering if every kindness you showed me, every conversation we shared, every moment of companionship was simply the price you paid for my money." Her voice remained steady, but he could hear the pain beneath the calm, could see it in the way she held herself so carefully erect, as though she might shatter if she allowed herself to bend. "I would rather have nothing," she said, "and know that any regard between us is genuine, than live in comfort and perpetual doubt, wondering always if I am valued or merely tolerated as the necessary cost of my fortune. And so I have freed us both from that uncertainty. You need no longer feel obligated to include me in your life out of gratitude for my wealth, and I need no longer wonder if your attention is purchased." Marcus stared at her, the righteous anger draining from him and leaving behind something far worse, a devastation that settled into his bones as her words penetrated his defenses, and he said with less force, "You had no right to make such a decision without consulting me." But even as he spoke, he heard the weakness in the argument, and Eleanor's slight sad smile told him she heard it too. "The money was mine to dispose of as I wished," she replied. "That was insured in our marriage contract. You had the dowry you needed. What remained was mine alone, and I have chosen to use it in ways that bring me peace rather than doubt. I have funded education for girls who would otherwise have none, provided for those who served my father faithfully and were cast aside when his business was sold, supported institutions that care for those who have no one else, and in doing so I have purchased something far more valuable than security. I have purchased the possibility of truth between us." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow more devastating. "If you wish me to leave, Lord Ashworth, I will go. I have enough remaining to live modestly somewhere quiet, and you will have your estate restored and your freedom to seek a wife who brings you more than I have. But if I am to stay, let it be because you wish it, not because you feel bound by gratitude or obligation." Marcus stood frozen, unable to form words, unable to process the enormity of what she had done and what it revealed about his own heart, about the careful lies he had been telling himself. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out rough and uncertain. "You should have told me," he said, but it was not an accusation now, merely the lost protest of a man whose world had just been transformed in ways he was not prepared to face, and Eleanor inclined her head in acknowledgement, but said nothing more. And Marcus turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, and her words followed him like ghosts, haunting him with the uncomfortable truth that she had seen clearly what he had refused to acknowledge, that somewhere in the months of their marriage of convenience, something profound had shifted, and now she had forced him to confront it, had stripped away the comfortable fiction that their arrangement was merely practical, and left him with a choice he had never wanted to make, to examine his own heart and discover what truly resided there. Marcus did not sleep that night, could not even bear to lie in his bed, but instead paced the length of his study as the hours crept toward dawn, and Eleanor's words echoed in his mind with relentless persistence, stripping away the comfortable lies he had constructed around his heart. And he found himself reviewing every moment since their wedding day, with a clarity that was painful in its honesty, seeing now what he had refused to acknowledge in the careful maintenance of his emotional distance. He remembered the garden, how in those early weeks he had noticed the neglected beds being restored, and had thought nothing of it beyond a passing irritation that she was changing things without consulting him. But now he recalled watching from his study window as Eleanor knelt in the soil with her own hands, dirt beneath her fingernails, and a look of quiet contentment on her face as she planted the roses his mother had loved. Flowers she could not have known held such meaning unless she had asked the servants. Had cared enough to learn what would bring him some small measure of comfort, even when he barely acknowledged her existence. He remembered the library, how he had been surprised to find it reorganized, but had merely accepted the improvement without considering the hours of labor it must have required, the intelligence and care evident in the new system that somehow made every volume more accessible while honoring the collection's history. And he thought now of finding her there so many evenings, curled in a chair with a book, and how he had begun to seek out those same books afterward, reading passages she had marked with careful pencil annotations that revealed a mind of remarkable depth and sensitivity. He remembered the music, those haunting melodies that had begun to fill the empty halls in the evenings, how he had stood outside the music room, listening to her play with a skill that spoke of years of dedicated practice, and how the pieces she chose were always melancholic and beautiful, and how he had found himself drawn to that doorway night after night, standing in the shadows, listening to her pour her loneliness into the keys, and he had never once acknowledged her gift, never thanked her for bringing beauty back into a house that had been silent for so long. He remembered the servants, how their demeanor had changed in the months since Eleanor's arrival, how they smiled more readily and moved through their duties with renewed purpose, and he had attributed it to the improved finances, to the security of regular wages, now that the estate was solvent again. But he understood now that it was Eleanor's kindness that had transformed them, her genuine interest in their lives and welfare, her quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it, and he thought of her supplementing their wages from her own small allowance, and felt shame burn through him at his earlier anger. He remembered their conversations, those increasingly frequent evenings when they had dined together and talked of philosophy and literature and the running of the estate, how she had listened to his opinions with genuine interest and offered her own thoughts with a diffidence that had seemed charming, but which he now recognized as the careful self-protection of someone who expected to be dismissed, and how, despite that caution, she had challenged his assumptions with arguments so well-reasoned he had found himself actually changing his mind on matters he had considered settled, and how those intellectual sparring matches had become the highlight of his days, though he had never admitted it even to himself. He remembered her smile, so rare in those early months, and growing gradually more frequent, and how it transformed her face in a way that made his breath catch, and how he had begun to seek out ways to earn that smile. Small acts of consideration, he told himself, were merely courtesy, but which he now recognized as the unconscious courtship of a man falling in love, despite his determination not to feel anything at all. And with that thought, that word he had not allowed himself to think, Marcus stopped his pacing and stood frozen in the center of his study as the truth crashed over him with devastating force. He loved her, loved Eleanor, not her fortune but the woman herself, the quiet strength and hidden depths, the kindness and intelligence and courage that had been there all along waiting for him to have the wisdom to see it, and he had fallen in love with her so gradually, through so many small moments accumulated over months, that he had not recognized the transformation of his own heart until she forced him to look at it directly. He loved the woman he had barely glanced at on their wedding day, had married for money and treated with cold politeness, and now she had freed them both from the financial obligation that bound them, and offered him a choice he had never thought to want to love her truly or let her go, and the realization left him standing alone in his study as pale dawn light began to filter through the windows, understanding at last that the fortune he had sought to save his estate meant nothing compared to the treasure he had found without recognizing it, and the crushing fear that he had discovered this truth too late, that his coldness and pride had destroyed any possibility of her returning his feelings, settled into his bones with a weight that made his earlier financial desperation seem trivial by comparison. Morning came with a pale and tentative light that seemed to mirror Marcus's own fragile state, and he found himself drawn from his study not to seek rest, but to walk the grounds that Eleanor had transformed, needing to see with newly opened eyes what she had created in the months of their strange marriage. And as he stepped into the garden, the autumn air carried the scent of the last roses, the blooms that would not have existed without her patient care, and he remembered now with piercing clarity the first time he had seen her kneeling in this very soil, how he had watched from his window with detached curiosity and perhaps mild annoyance that she was altering his mother's garden without permission. But she had not been altering it, he understood now, and she had been restoring it, bringing back to life something precious that he had allowed to die through neglect and grief. He walked among the carefully tended beds and saw not just flowers but hours of labor, Eleanor's hands working the earth, her quiet determination to give him back a piece of his past, even when he gave her nothing but cold courtesy in return. And he touched the petals of a rose his mother had particularly loved, a deep crimson variety that Eleanor could only have known to plant if she had asked the elderly gardener, who remembered, if she had cared enough to learn the history of this place and honor it, and the tenderness of that gesture, the thoughtfulness it revealed, made his throat tight with an emotion he had forbidden himself for so long. He continued walking, seeing the garden paths she had cleared, the stone bench she had restored where his mother used to sit on summer evenings, and he could picture Eleanor there in the fading light, perhaps thinking of her own lost family, her own displacement, and finding some comfort in creating beauty from abandonment. And he realized she had been so alone in those early months, as alone as he had been, but without even the cold comfort of pride to sustain her, merely the knowledge that she was unwanted except for the fortune she brought. And yet she had met that loneliness not with bitterness, but with grace, had poured her isolation into acts of quiet restoration that asked nothing in return. He left the garden and walked to the library, letting himself into the familiar room where he had spent so many hours, and he saw it now as Eleanor had arranged it. The volumes organized with an intelligence that spoke of true understanding, not merely alphabetical order, but thoughtful categorization that revealed which books spoke to one another, which authors belonged in conversation. And he pulled down a volume at random and found her penciled notes in the margins, questions and observations that showed she had read deeply and thought carefully, and he remembered their conversations about these very books, how she had challenged his interpretations with arguments so well constructed he had been forced to reconsider positions he had held for years, and how those intellectual exchanges had become something he anticipated with an eagerness he had refused to name. He moved through the house, seeing her presence everywhere, in the way the morning room now caught the light through curtains she had replaced, in the fresh flowers that appeared regularly in the hall, and in the small acts of care that had made this cold monument into something approaching a home again. And he understood with devastating clarity that she had given him far more than money. She had given him life, and had breathed warmth back into rooms that had been mausoleums to his family's faded glory, had filled silence with music and conversation, and had offered him companionship and intelligence and kindness when he had given her nothing but the shell of a marriage. And the weight of that gift, the generosity of it, settled into his chest like a physical ache. He returned to his study and stood before the portrait of his mother, seeing in her painted face a gentleness he had forgotten, and he thought she would have loved Eleanor. He would have recognized in her the strength that wore no armor, the courage that needed no loud proclamation, and he spoke aloud to the portrait, as he had not done since childhood, saying, "I have been a fool. Mother, I have had treasure in my house and called it merely transaction. I have been given grace and responded with coldness, and now I fear I have discovered my heart too late." And the painted eyes seemed to look at him with a sadness that understood both failure and the possibility of redemption. And Marcus knew then what he must do, though the doing of it terrified him more than any financial ruin ever had, for he must prove to Eleanor that his love was real, must find a way to show her that the man who had married her for money had become someone who would choose her above all fortune. And the question that haunted him as morning strengthened into day was simply this: how does one demonstrate love to a woman who has every reason to believe herself valued only for what she can provide? And how can a proud man humble himself enough to deserve a second chance he has done nothing to earn? Marcus found Eleanor in the morning room, pale autumn light falling across her face as she sat with her hands folded in her lap. And there was about her a stillness that spoke of decisions already made, a quiet resignation that filled him with panic. And when he entered, she looked up with eyes that held wariness where once there had been tentative hope, and he understood that his anger the previous evening had done damage that could not be easily undone, had confirmed for her what she had perhaps always suspected, that she was valued only for what she could provide, and now that she had removed that value, she expected to be discarded. He approached with uncertain steps, this man who had always moved through the world with aristocratic confidence, and found himself fumbling for words that had never come easily to him, words of feeling rather than transaction, and what emerged was awkward and insufficient. "Eleanor, we must speak of what transpired yesterday," he began, and she inclined her head with a formality that cut him, and he continued, "I spoke in anger, and I regret the harshness of my words," but even as he said it, he knew it was not enough, was merely the shell of an apology without the substance she deserved, and he saw her fingers tighten almost imperceptibly in her lap. She responded with the quiet dignity that had become her armor. "You had every right to be angry, my lord. I acted without consulting you in matters that concerned the estate, and I understand if you feel I have overstepped." And the distance in her voice, the return to formal address after months of using his given name, told him how thoroughly she had retreated behind her defenses, and he wanted to cross the space between them and take her hands in his, but did not know if he had any right to such intimacy, if he had ever truly earned it. He tried again, with more honesty this time. "It was not anger at your actions, but at myself, at my own, at the realization that I have." But the words tangled in his throat, these feelings he had suppressed for so long, refusing to take coherent shape. And he saw confusion flicker across her face, perhaps the faintest spark of something that might have been hope, and he pressed forward clumsily. "You have given me far more than I ever gave you, and I have been ungrateful, and I wish." But wish for what? He did not know how to say, did not know how to bridge the chasm his pride had created. Eleanor rose then, and there was about her movements a finality that terrified him, and she said softly, "I think it would be best if I returned to my father's house for a time, to give us both space, to consider what arrangement would be in most suitable going forward." And the word arrangement struck him like a physical blow, this return to the language of their beginning, this reduction of what they had become to mere contractual considerations, and he realized with awful clarity that she was preparing to leave, was offering him the escape he had once thought he wanted, and the prospect of her absence, of this house without her quiet presence, was suddenly unendurable. He spoke then without thinking, without the careful construction of words he had always employed. "Please don't go." And the rawness in his voice surprised them both. "I cannot. I do not wish you to leave." And she turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw confusion and hurt and the terrible vulnerability of someone who has been valued only for utility and dares not believe in anything more, and he knew then that his clumsy attempts at conversation would never be enough, that words which had always been his tools of control and distance would not serve him now, and he must find another way to prove what his heart had finally acknowledged, and must demonstrate through action rather than speech that the man who had married her for fortune had become someone who would choose her above all wealth, above pride, above the comfort of emotional distance, but standing before her in the pale morning light, seeing her prepared to walk away from a marriage that had been transaction, but had somehow, despite his resistance, become the foundation of something real, he felt the full weight of his own inadequacy, his years of careful emotional control leaving him utterly unprepared for the simple, terrifying act of offering his heart to someone who had every reason to refuse it. Marcus spent the remainder of that day in his study, not attempting further conversation, but instead engaged in correspondence that cost him more than any financial transaction ever had, writing first to his solicitor with instructions that must have seemed incomprehensible to that practical man, then to Eleanor's father, with words that required him to strip away every vestige of pride he had spent a lifetime cultivating, and finally drafting a document that represented the complete inversion of everything their marriage had been founded upon. And as the afternoon light faded and his hand cramped from writing, He looked at what he had created and felt the terror of a man standing at the edge of an abyss, with no certainty of what lay below, only the knowledge that remaining where he stood was no longer possible. The following morning he requested Eleanor's presence in the library, that room which had witnessed their first real conversation and which seemed somehow appropriate for what he must now do. And when she entered with cautious steps and guarded eyes, he gestured to the chair across from his desk with a formality that belied the trembling in his hands, and she sat with the quiet composure she wore like armor, waiting for him to speak, perhaps expecting dismissal or some new coldness, certainly not prepared for what he was about to offer. He slid the document across the desk to her, his voice steady though his heart hammered against his ribs. "I have prepared this for you to read, Eleanor. It concerns the terms of our marriage and your freedom to determine your own future." And he watched her unfold the pages with hands that shook slightly, saw her eyes move across the legal language that his solicitor had drafted under protest, terms that offered her complete release from their marriage if she desired it, the return of her entire dowry to her personal control, and a settlement that would provide for her independently for the remainder of her life, all of it legally binding and requiring nothing from her but her signature should she choose to accept. She read in silence while he sat across from her, forcing himself not to look away, not to retreat into the emotional distance that had always been his refuge. And he watched the color drain from her face as she understood what she was holding, this offer of absolute freedom that came with no conditions, no requirements, no obligations, and when she finally looked up at him, her eyes held confusion and something that might have been fear. And she said with a voice barely above a whisper, "I do not understand, Marcus. You are offering to dissolve our marriage entirely." He leaned forward then, abandoning the safety of his desk, and spoke with a raw honesty that felt like tearing open his own chest. "I am offering you a choice, Eleanor, the choice you never had when your father and I arranged this marriage between us. I am telling you that you are free to leave, free to take your fortune and build whatever life you wish without the burden of a husband who married you for money and gave you nothing but coldness in return, and I will not contest it, will not stand in your way, will ensure that society knows the fault was entirely mine so that no shadow falls upon your reputation." She stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language, the document trembling in her hands, and he continued before his courage could fail. "But I want you to know something before you decide. I need you to understand that the man who married you for your dowry no longer exists, that somewhere in these months of living under the same roof, of watching you restore what I had allowed to die, of talking with you in this library and walking with you through gardens you brought back to life, I became someone I did not recognize, someone who values your presence more than any fortune, your conversation more than any social standing, of your smile more than the restoration of my family's faded glory." He saw tears forming in her eyes and did not know if they signified hope or grief, but he had begun this terrible, necessary confession and could not stop now. "I have no right to ask anything of you, Eleanor. I know this. I have been cold when you deserved warmth, proud when you offered kindness, distant when you tried to bridge the space between us. But if you choose to stay, if you choose to remain in this marriage, know that it would not be out of obligation or arrangement. It would be because I am choosing you, because I would choose you with nothing. Because the fortune I truly need is not the one that saved my estate, but the one that has been living quietly in my house, playing piano when she thinks no one listens, reading philosophy in the library, making a home from what was merely a monument to the past." He reached across the desk, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the intention. "You gave me freedom by removing the reason for our marriage, and now I give you freedom by offering to release you from it entirely. And whatever you choose, Eleanor, know that you have already given me far more than I ever gave you. You have given me back my life, my home, my capacity to feel something beyond pride and duty, and for that I will be eternally grateful whether you stay or go." Eleanor sat with the document trembling in her hands, and the silence that filled the library was so profound that Marcus could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, in each second an eternity as he waited for her response, as he watched emotions flicker across her face too quickly for him to decipher. And he realized with terrible clarity that he had placed his entire future in her hands and had given her the power to walk away from him forever, and the fear of that possibility was unlike anything he had ever experienced, far more devastating than the prospect of losing his estate or his family name, for those were merely things, while she had become essential to his very existence in ways he was only beginning to understand. She looked up from the pages, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when she spoke her voice was barely audible. "You would truly let me go?" And there was in her question not triumph, but something that sounded almost like grief, and he answered with absolute honesty, "I would, though it would destroy me, because keeping you bound to a marriage you entered unwillingly would destroy me more slowly, but just as surely, and I love you too much to trap you in a cage of obligation and legal contracts." The word love hung between them, spoken aloud for the first time, and he saw her breath catch, saw her fingers tighten on the document until the paper crumpled slightly, and she asked in a whisper that shook, "You love me?" And he nodded, unable to speak for a moment, then found his voice again. "I love you, Eleanor. I love your kindness and your intelligence, your quiet strength, and the way you see beauty where I saw only decay. I love the gardens you restored and the music you play, and the way you speak to the servants as though they matter. I love who I am becoming because of you, and I am terrified that I have realized this too late, that my coldness and pride have already driven you too far away." She set the document down on the desk with deliberate care, and Marcus felt his heart sink, certain she was preparing her departure, preparing to exercise the freedom he had given her. But then she rose from her chair and moved around the desk, and when she stood before him, there was in her eyes something he had never seen directed at him before, something that looked remarkably like love returned, and she asked with a trembling voice, "And if I choose to stay?" And the question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility, with the chance for something neither of them had dared to hope for when they spoke their vows in that cold ceremony months ago. His breath caught in his throat, and he stood from his chair, standing before her close enough now that he could see the tears beginning to spill down her cheeks, could see the hope and fear warring in her expression, and he answered with a voice that broke on the words, "Then I would count myself the most fortunate man alive, Eleanor, not because of any dowry or fortune, but because you specifically, chose to remain with me, despite having every reason to leave, despite my failures and my coldness and my inability to see what was before me, until you made me see it." She reached out then, her hand finding his, and the touch was electric, more intimate than any contact they had shared in all their months of marriage, and she said softly, "I choose to stay, Marcus, not as your obligation but as your choice, because somewhere in these quiet months I fell in love with you too, with the man beneath the pride, the one who walks his ancestral grounds with such reverence, who speaks of philosophy with passion, and who has been so alone for so long that he forgot how to let anyone close. And I want to stay. I want to build something real with you, something that has nothing to do with arrangements or dowries or social climbing, and everything to do with two people who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances." He pulled her into his arms then, this embrace the first true one of their marriage, and held her as though she might vanish if he loosened his grip, and against her hair he whispered, Thank you for staying, for giving me another chance, for seeing something in me worth loving when I had given you so little reason to." And she held him just as tightly, and they stood there in the library where they had first truly spoken, surrounded by books and autumn light, no longer bound by contract but choosing each other freely, and it felt like a beginning rather than a continuation, like the first genuine moment of a marriage that had started as transaction but would become, through patience and courage and the willingness to be vulnerable, something infinitely more precious than any fortune could purchase. The days that followed their confession in the library marked the true beginning of their marriage, and Marcus approached this second courtship with a determination that would have astonished the proud, distant man who had stood beside Eleanor at the altar months before, for he had been given something precious and undeserved, a second chance to win the heart of a woman he had treated with cold indifference, and he would not squander it through pride or emotional cowardice. He began by asking if she would walk with him through the gardens the following morning, a simple request that nevertheless felt momentous, and when she agreed with a shy smile that transformed her face into something luminous, he felt his heart constrict with tenderness and an almost painful awareness of how much time they had wasted in formal distance. They walked among the roses she had coaxed back to life, and he told her stories he had never shared with anyone, memories of his mother tending these very same flowers, and of his father's quiet disappointment when Marcus had chosen books over horses, of the loneliness of inheriting an estate that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, and Eleanor listened with those perceptive eyes that saw past his words to the vulnerable boy still hiding beneath the aristocratic facade, and she shared her own stories in return, tales of a childhood spent in her father's counting houses, feeling neither quite merchant class nor accepted by the society her father's wealth might purchase, of books read in secret, because young ladies were not supposed to concern themselves with philosophy, of dreams she had tucked away because they seemed impossible for someone of her station. They spent hours in conversation now, in the library and the gardens and the music room where she played while he sat and listened with open appreciation, no longer pretending he was elsewhere, no longer hiding his presence outside the door, and he asked her to teach him the pieces she loved most, and though his fingers were clumsy on the keys, she guided them with patience and laughter that filled the old house with warmth it had not known in decades. He brought her small gifts, nothing extravagant but chosen with care, a first edition of a philosophy text she had mentioned admiring, wildflowers gathered from the meadow beyond the formal gardens, a shawl in deep blue because he had noticed her shivering one evening, and she received each offering with a pleasure that seemed disproportionate to their modest value, and he understood that she treasured them precisely because they represented thought and attention rather than purchased obligation. One afternoon in the library, surrounded by the books that had witnessed both their first real conversation and their confession of love, Marcus reached for Eleanor's hand with a tenderness that still felt new and slightly frightening in its vulnerability, and she turned to him with a question in her eyes, and he drew her closer, asking with his gaze for permission. She granted with the slightest nod, and he kissed her for the first time as a man kissing the woman he loved, rather than a husband performing martial duty, and the kiss was gentle and unhurried, tasting of tea and promises, and when they parted, Eleanor's eyes were bright with tears and wonder, and Marcus rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I am learning to love you properly, Eleanor, learning to see you and value you and cherish you as I should have done from the beginning." And she replied with a voice thick with emotion, "And I am learning that the proud nobleman I married was hiding a man of unexpected gentleness, and I love both versions of you, the one you show the world and the one you are brave enough to show me." They began dining together every evening, not out of obligation but genuine desire for each other's company, and the servants who had once whispered about the strange coldness of the young master and his bride now smiled to see them, laughing over dinner, to hear their voices carrying from the music room, to observe the way Marcus's hand would find Eleanor's as they walked, the way she would look at him with such open affection, and the house itself seemed to respond to this transformation, becoming a home rather than merely an ancestral monument. Months had passed since that transformative moment in the library, and the Ashworth estate had undergone a metamorphosis that went far beyond the physical repairs Eleanor's dowry had funded, for the true restoration was one of spirit and purpose, a breathing of life into halls that had forgotten warmth, and Marcus and Eleanor had become not merely husband and wife bound by legal contract, but genuine partners who worked side by side in the restoration of both property and souls. The morning routine had evolved into something Marcus cherished with an intensity that still sometimes surprised him, for he would wake now in the rooms they shared, their separate quarters abandoned months ago, and he would watch Eleanor in the early light, her hair loose around her shoulders, and feel gratitude so profound it was almost painful for the second chance he had been given, for the transformation love had worked upon his proud and isolated heart. They took breakfast together in the small morning room that overlooked the gardens Eleanor had restored to glory, discussing the day's tasks with an ease that came from genuine partnership rather than forced civility, and Marcus found himself valuing her counsel on matters he once would have considered solely his domain, for she possessed a practical intelligence and understanding of people that complemented his knowledge of tradition and estate management. Eleanor had found her place at Ashworth not as a bought bride seeking acceptance, but as a force of gentle revolution, transforming the relationship between the manor and its staff through kindness that was never condescending, through genuine interest in their lives and well-being. And the servants who had once whispered about the cold young master and his unwanted bride now spoke with affection of how the house had come alive again, how laughter echoed in corridors that had known only silence, how the master and mistress could be seen walking the grounds hand in hand like young lovers, rather than contractual partners. The physical changes to the estate reflected the emotional transformation within its walls, for where there had been decay, there was now careful restoration. Where gardens had run wild, there was now cultivated beauty that honored the past, while embracing new growth, and Marcus understood that every improvement they made together was a metaphor for what they had accomplished within themselves and between each other, and the patient work of rebuilding something valuable from foundations that had nearly crumbled. When autumn arrived again, marking a full year since their marriage, the local gentry held a harvest celebration at a neighboring estate, and Marcus and Eleanor attended together, and as they entered the ballroom, Marcus was acutely aware of how different this felt from that hollow wedding reception where society had whispered and judged. For now he walked beside Eleanor with pride that had nothing to do with social position and everything to do with love for the remarkable woman who had saved him from a loneliness he had not even recognized as suffering. When the music began and he led Eleanor to the dance floor, holding her in his arms as they moved together with a grace born of genuine harmony, he was aware of others watching, but their observations no longer carried the weight of judgment, for what people saw now was unmistakable. Two people who looked at each other with such open affection, such obvious delight in one another's presence, that the love between them became a visible thing, transforming them both in ways that transcended social climbing or financial transaction. Eleanor smiled up at him as they danced, that free and genuine smile he had once thought impossible to coax from her serious face, and she whispered, "You're staring at me, husband. What will people think?" And he replied without hesitation, his voice warm with affection and truth. "They will think I am a man hopelessly in love with his wife," which happens to be absolutely accurate. And her laughter was like music, and he realized that this ordinary moment of dancing and laughing and loving was the extraordinary fortune he had never known he was seeking, the wealth that could not be counted in pounds or properties, but only in the quiet transformation of two lonely souls who had found in each other not just companionship, but a reason to believe that even arrangements born of desperation could, through patience and courage and the willingness to truly see one another, become something infinitely more precious than any transaction could purchase. 3 years had passed since that cold autumn day when Marcus Ashworth had stood in his study, surrounded by unpaid bills and crushing desperation, and the transformation that had occurred in those years extended far beyond what any ledger could calculate or any society matron could have predicted. For the estate that had once seemed a crumbling monument to faded glory now flourished, with a vitality that spoke of careful stewardship and genuine love, and the couple who had begun their marriage as strangers bound by financial necessity had become something far more precious, partners in every sense, bound by affection that deepened with each passing season. On a golden afternoon in early autumn, Marcus and Eleanor walked through the gardens that had become a testament to their collaboration, the roses blooming in profusion thanks to Eleanor's continued devotion and Marcus's newfound appreciation for the beauty of growing things, and between them toddled their daughter Catherine, not yet 3 years old, with her mother's serious eyes and her father's dark curls, and in Eleanor's arms rested their infant son Thomas, barely 6 months old, and already showing signs of his father's strong will in the way he clutched at the world with determined fists. Marcus watched Eleanor as she knelt to help Catherine examine a particularly vibrant bloom, her movements easy with the unconscious grace of motherhood, and he felt the familiar swell of gratitude and wonder that still struck him at unexpected moments. Gratitude that she had chosen to stay when he had offered her freedom. Wonder that this quiet woman with downcast eyes had proven to possess a strength and depth that had not merely saved his estate, but had saved him from a lifetime of proud isolation. The house behind them stood restored to beauty through their joint efforts and careful management, no longer relying solely on Eleanor's dowry but on intelligent investment and genuine partnership. For Eleanor had proven to have her father's head for business combined with a compassion he had lacked, and she had guided Marcus in transforming the estate from a drain on resources into a productive enterprise that honored tradition while embracing practical innovation, and together they had created something sustainable, not through wealth alone, but through vision and collaboration. Catherine called out with delight as a butterfly landed near her, and Marcus swept her up in his arms, spinning her until she shrieked with laughter, and Eleanor watched them with a smile that transformed her face, No longer the tentative expression of a woman uncertain of her welcome, but the free and joyous smile of someone who knew herself beloved. And when Marcus met her eyes over their daughter's head, the look that passed between them carried the weight of 3 years' accumulated tenderness. Countless small moments of choosing each other, of building something real from the ashes of what had begun as merely mercenary arrangement. They had become fixtures at local society gatherings, no longer the source of whispered speculation about merchant daughters buying titles, but rather admired as a couple whose genuine affection was evident in every interaction, whose partnership extended beyond the ballroom into the practical management of a thriving estate, whose children were being raised with both aristocratic heritage and the values of kindness and industry that Eleanor had brought from her merchant background, and Marcus found he cared nothing for what society thought. As long as Eleanor smiled at him across the dinner table, as long as their children grew healthy and loved, as long as he woke each morning beside the woman who had taught him that fortune came in forms he had never imagined in those desperate days when he had agreed to marry a stranger for her dowry. As the sun began to set, painting the gardens in shades of amber and gold, Marcus gathered his family close, Eleanor leaning against his shoulder with Thomas drowsing in her arms, Catherine chattering about the butterfly and the flowers and asking if they might pick some for her room. And in this simple moment of domestic peace, Marcus understood with perfect clarity that he had found the fortune he never knew he was seeking. Not in Eleanor's dowry or the restoration of his estate, but in the transformation of 2 lonely souls who had been brave enough to see past pride and fear and financial transaction to discover that love, when given freely and received with gratitude, was the only wealth that truly mattered, the only inheritance worth passing to the children who would carry forward not just the Ashworth name, but the legacy of what their parents had built together through patience and courage and the willingness to begin again. Evening descended upon Ashworth Estate with the gentle grace of autumn twilight, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold, and as Marcus and Eleanor stood together on the terrace watching their children play in the gardens below, Catherine chasing fireflies, while Thomas took his unsteady first steps on the lawn under a nursemaid's watchful eye, there was a quality of peace in the moment that felt almost sacred, a quietness that spoke of journeys completed and transformations fully realized. And Marcus reflected on how far they had traveled from that desperate day when he had agreed to marry a stranger for her fortune, how the man who had seen Eleanor as nothing more than a transaction had been transformed into someone who understood that the greatest wealth was standing beside him, holding his hand as they watched the life they had built together unfold before them in the laughter of their children and the beauty of gardens restored and a home made warm again through love rather than obligation. Dear listener, perhaps you have heard this story and recognize something of your own struggles within it, for who among us has not at some point looked at life through the narrow lens of necessity, seeing only what we think we need rather than what we might discover if we opened our hearts to possibility? And Marcus and Eleanor's journey reminds us that love cannot be purchased or arranged or forced into being through contracts and dowries, but it can be discovered in the most unexpected places if we are brave enough to look beyond our pride and fear and truly see the person standing before us. The lesson their story teaches is not that arranged marriages lead to happiness, but rather that transformation is always possible when we choose vulnerability over protection, when we risk seeing and being seen, when we understand that real value lies not in wealth or position or social standing, but in the courage to connect with another human soul in all its complexity and beauty. And this truth applies not merely to romantic love, but to every relationship we navigate in this uncertain world, every moment when we must decide whether to maintain our walls or risk the discomfort of genuine connection. Consider how often we make Marcus's mistake, seeing people as functions rather than fully realized beings, as solutions to our problems rather than individuals worthy of our attention and care. And consider, too, how often we are like Eleanor, quietly present in situations where we are not truly valued, hoping that patience and kindness might eventually be recognized, and the courage it takes to demand more, to insist that we be chosen freely rather than accepted reluctantly, to risk losing what little we have in the hope of finding something real. Their story reminds us that pride and fear are the enemies of love, that assumptions blind us to what is before us, that the treasures we seek are often already present, If only we would stop looking past them towards some imagined fortune, and that the willingness to begin again, to admit we were wrong, to choose differently, is never wasted, even when it requires us to sacrifice our carefully constructed defenses and step into the unknown territory of authentic emotion. So as you go about your days, dear listener, encountering people you might dismiss too quickly, facing relationships that seem merely transactional or convenient, remember Marcus and Eleanor. Remember that transformation happens not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small moments of genuine seeing, of patient presence, of choosing connection over comfort, and that the fortune you seek might already be present in your life, waiting only for you to recognize its value and claim it with the courage of someone willing to love freely rather than fearfully. May you find the strength to see beyond surfaces to the depths beneath. May you discover in unexpected places the connection your soul has been seeking. May you know the peace that comes from choosing love over pride and vulnerability over protection. And may you rest tonight with the knowledge that you, like Marcus and Eleanor, are capable of transformation, worthy of being chosen, deserving of a love that sees you truly and chooses you freely. And may this story stay with you as a reminder that the greatest fortunes are not counted in coins, but in moments of genuine connection, in gardens restored, in music that fills empty halls, in the quiet miracle of two souls who found each other in the darkness and chose to walk together into light. And if this story has touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need its message. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of transformation and hope. And remember always that love, when given freely, is the only wealth that truly matters, the only inheritance worth leaving, the only fortune worth seeking in this brief and precious life we share.